Relevant and welcome to OCR History B, Making of America 1789 to 1900 content videos. This video will focus on the second theme, which is the West 1839 to 1860. Just a reminder of our timeline for the Making of America. We have 5 themes to remember throughout the course, and you will need to know the dates of all of these confidently to ensure that your evidence is applicable to the question. Remember, on the timeline that will appear on the screen, the presidents for each section are in red at the bottom. You don't need to know all of these, but you do need to know the names of those who introduced key legislation. So, for example, Andrew Jackson with the Indian Removal Act in 1830 for theme 1. So the first theme that we've already covered on a previous video is America's expansion. Why did the USA expand and what caused that to happen? This video is relating to the West with the dates of 1839 to 1860. So we're looking at why did people begin to migrate to the far west of America. Period 3, remember, has 2 themes within it, and they are the American Civil War and settlement and conflict on the plains. And our final time period is American cultures with the dates 1877 to 1900. So really want to impress upon you here the importance of knowing the dates of each of the themes to make sure that your evidence for each question is applicable to the question you are answering. So just as some contextual information for you, when we are speaking about the West, 1839 to 1860, our second theme, we need to know about the plains, and this is the area between the Rocky Mountains and the Mississippi River. So this is the area where the indigenous people had been pushed into following the Indian Removal Act of 1830. However, when they arrived there were already other tribes there. These Plains Indians were groups such as the Lakota Sioux, and they are the tribes that you need to know about for this second theme. So for the second theme, you will need to know about the culture of the Plains Indians. Now, I am going to put 3 groups on screen, which are the Lakota Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Nez Perce, but I'm only going to speak you through the Lakota Sioux, who are in pink on the right-hand side. That is because they are the main tribe on the plains during our second time period, and they are the ones that you are all most familiar with. So we need to know that this tribe are nomadic, which means that they follow the buffalo. They do not stay in one set place. The buffalo has huge significance to them, so they use it for food, to make shelter, for example the hide to make the teepees, and they use the stomach for the cooking pot, the bladder for a water carrier, etc. I'm sure you remember these from lesson. You also need to know that they live in teepees, which helps with their nomadic lifestyle of moving around. They are very spiritual, so we have the Great Spirit of Wakantanka and the Black Hills of Dakota, which was where all of their ancestors were buried. We know that the Lakota Sioux were very hostile to white Americans, understandably, after looking at American expansion in the first theme, and the idea that other natives had been pushed into this land west of the Mississippi River. And finally, we have warrior societies who were fighting on horseback with bows and guns. So please have a read through the Cheyenne and the Nez Perce as well. But as I say, the Lakota Sioux are going to be the main tribe that you would reference if you were asked about the culture of the Plains Indians in the exam. So a key question that you could be asked for the second theme of the West 1839 to 1860 is the question of why did the white Americans migrate west? So there are numerous reasons for that, and we are going to go through the causes of that now. So first of all, in 1837, you need to know that the banks collapsed in the east. So many people had lost their savings, wages were cut and jobs were lost. And as a result of this, our explanation here, if we were asked a 10-mark question and we were looking for a Peel paragraph, is that people felt that they had nothing to lose. So they decide that they're going to move west, hoping for new opportunities because the economic situation in the east is so dire. We also have early explorers that had spread rumours that the climate was better in the west, so reports were reaching the east saying how successful farming in the west could be, so people decide that they are going to make the move in the hope that they can make their fortune. We have a specific act that is passed in 1841 called the Preemption Act. So this was passed in Oregon, and it allowed a farmer who built a house and cleared the trees around it to be given the first opportunity to buy the surrounding land. So what this did was stop land speculators from buying all of the land up, as we had already seen in theme 1, and it gives farmers encouragement to move west. So the Preemption Act is a more specific example that you could give in the exam, which would definitely impress an examiner if you could explain that accurately. We then have the belief in manifest destiny, which remember is God's will for white Americans to expand west. Some Christians believed it was their mission also to convert Indians or indigenous people to Christianity. So the idea that God is actively encouraging white Americans to move west is a reason for migration during this period. We have, by 1840, mountain men and explorers had mapped routes which would allow many to make the journey west safely, which would encourage more to migrate. Again, worth noting here, Lewis and Clark are in our first time period, not this one. So we are speaking about mountain men in this particular theme. We know that the journey west was very, very difficult, so it took around 8 months. They would have faced extreme weather, stampeding buffalo and understandably aggressive natives. They had to trek over the Rockies with all of their belongings, and diseases such as cholera were a real problem. Many got trapped and could starve to death. And if you were heading to California, you would have to trek across deserts and the mountains of Sierra Nevada. And if you were heading to Oregon, you would need to trek across the Blue Mountains. So you could get a 9-mark question that was in relation to migration west. And of course, you could speak about the challenges on the journey if you were to write an answer to that response. In terms of who migrated west during this time period, a group that should come to mind is the Mormons. So the Mormons were a group of Christians. They were a Christian denomination, and they were established in the early 19th century. They became popular in the US in the 1830s. And the main thing that you need to know about the Mormons, because this lends itself well to explanation if it was a peel paragraph that you were writing, is the reason why they move west. So they move because of the persecution that they are facing in the east. And the main reason they are facing persecution is because of their unique belief in polygamy, which is a man having multiple wives. So this leads to a lot of discrimination and leads to them wanting to escape really to the west. Their leader was somebody called Brigham Young, who chose Utah as the place to build the Mormon settlement, which he called Salt Lake City. So it'd be good in the exam to be able to reference both Utah and Salt Lake City as specifics. The Mormon Church decided how much land each family got. Nobody was going to be allowed to own their own water, and farming was the main job for the Mormons. It's this idea of shared ownership, so everybody is contributing to the well-being of everybody else. We have the Mormon Temple, which was built in the centre of Salt Lake City, indicating its importance. And Young wanted Utah to become a state, but instead the US government allowed it to be recognised as a territory. Between 1850 and 1860, the Mormons continued to grow and spread rapidly over the new territory, which was in Utah. And finally, in 1857, we have a group of Mormons who were massacred, some settlers they believed to be US spies. So we have a violent reaction here from the Mormons, which affected the way that people perceived them. Remember, they have been saying that they are a Christian group who are moral, etc. So the fact that they have massacred some settlers really affects their reputation. The scandal forces Young to step down as the governor of Utah, and Utah then has to follow the same rules as the rest of the US, including the rules on marriage. So that's an overview of who the Mormons were as a group, obviously a very quick one, but the red information on screen, as I said, is the main thing that you need to remember, that the reason they have moved west in the first place is to escape persecution, predominantly because of their belief in polygamy. So the second group that you may consider when you are writing your answer on migration west, if that came up, would probably be the California Gold Rush, or the 49ers. So first of all, how was gold discovered? It was discovered by James Marshall, who found gold at John Sutter's mill. Sam Brannan was the person who spread the word about the gold being found, and President Polk then confirmed that gold had been found, which confirmed to many that there was a reason to move to California. So his words of confirmation really encouraged the gold rush to begin. Stories began to circulate of men making $1,000 a day, and over 50,000 Americans headed to California in 1849 alone, as I've said, known as the 49ers. So that statistic of 50,000 would be a really good specific to include in the exam. So we had some opportunists who were selling equipment that made more money than the miners themselves. So, for example, Levi's, who was selling jeans, and then we had men selling axes, pans and tents. In impact number 1, so California became a free state in 1850. As so many white Americans had flocked there, this gave the people there more political rights, and San Francisco became a thriving city and seaport. So just a reminder here that if you have a 9-mark question, you would need to speak about your C's and your S. So one of those C's being consequence, you could discuss there that California becomes a state in 1850. The next impact is that natives were shot by gold miners such as the 49ers, and violence was actively encouraged by the Californian government. So in 1850s it was law that any native who couldn't prove he had a job could be sold to white settlers as slave labour. So this really indicates to us the discrimination being shown towards the natives or the indigenous people, but also the impact that these migrants had on the natives' way of life. Okay, so when they moved to California, this is some of the violent action that was taken against them, which again would be a good consequence to describe in the exam. And finally, we have the environmental damage that happens as a result of the Californian gold rush. So this is where high-powered water jets were used to release quartz from the mountains, and hillsides as a result of this were eaten away. Rivers were clogged with dirt and gravel, and flooding became a problem too. Chemicals were also used to extract gold, killed fish and wildlife in the area. So for me, the easiest to remember really are the flooding and the chemicals. It is completely up to you which ones you revise. You do not need to know all of them, just as long as you know that they are supporting evidence if you were to write on a point about environmental damage caused by the Californian gold rush. So there is another gold rush that takes place during this period of American history, and that is Pikes Peak Gold Rush, 1858 to 1859. Now, it is worth pointing out that there has been a question that has specifically spoken about Pikes Peak Gold Rush. So I think generally as a year group we're all more confident with California, so it is worth having a look at this information on Pikes Peak so that you could speak about that specifically if it was to come up in the exam. So news spread in the east of gold being found in the Kansas territory through newspapers. The recession in 1857 had helped to encourage over 100,000 people to make the journey to Pikes Peak. So if you're thinking statistical differences, 50,000 remember to California, 100,000 to Pikes Peak. Differences from the California Gold Rush then. First of all, we've got rail lines which helped people travel from east to west. The landscape was much easier to cross than the mountains into California, so this is a reason really why we have double the number of people who travel there. And we also have town boosters, and these are people who exaggerated the ease of getting to the gold making. They made it sound as though it was their town that was the place to stay, the place to be, and these people really encourage an increase in the number of people that moved west. In terms of the impact of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, Kansas becomes a state in 1861 as so many white Americans had flocked there. So Kansas was now a place to locate, not just to pass through. So similar to California, there are so many white Americans that flock there that the area becomes a state. Impact number 2, natives, again similar to California, they lose out to white Americans. So white settlers wanted to settle on the plains in the areas which traditionally had belonged to the Arapaho and the Cheyenne, and this forced the natives further from their land to hunt and cause tension and anger. So you can speak about the impact on natives as well for the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. And finally, the US government were becoming convinced that natives would simply give in and hand their land to the US, but actually war was becoming increasingly likely. And this is a result of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush and the tension that is caused as a result of so many white Americans flocking to areas that were traditionally held by the indigenous people. Okay, so what was the impact of migration on the plains? So first of all, unsurprisingly, we have the effect that it has on the Plains Indians. So migration meant many white migrants cutting through the hunting grounds of the plains tribes, such as the Lakota Sioux. This caused tension as their trails disturbed the buffalo and their nomadic way of life, which remember means that they are following the buffalo. There was also lots of conflict as tribes were having to cross one another's land due to the reduced space as a result of the amount of white migrants that had appeared. Treaties had to be signed with the Plains Indians, such as the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, where tribes such as the Lakota Sioux granted the USA rights to establish forts and safe routes along the plains in return for compensation. So you could speak about that as a very specific example of a consequence or an impact of migration on the plains. Smaller Plains tribes such as the Crow were angry that the Sioux had gained higher compensation from the government, which then causes disputes between the Plains tribes. So we've now not just got conflict between white Americans and Native Americans, we've got tribes between different groups of indigenous people. And we have the Yakima Treaty. In 1855, the US government signed a treaty with the Yakima, stating that the government could have Plains land, but that settlement wouldn't happen for 2 years. Within 12 days, however, the settlers were arriving, so the government made this deal, say they've got their land for 2 years, and that is completely ignored. As a result of this, the Yakima are very angry, so they begin to raid white settlements, and the US Army were called in. So by 1858, the Yakima had lost 90% of their land, and 24 of their chiefs had been hanged or shot. So that is a really specific example that explains really the magnitude of the impact of migration on the natives. So the Yakima Treaty would be a really good specific piece of evidence to explain in the exam. So overall, it is a completely negative impact as a result of migration between the US government and the natives and Plains tribes, with other tribes as well. So in terms of key takeaways, key things that you need to know about this particular unit, you need to be able to explain what the culture of the Plains Indians was like, the reasons why Americans migrated west during this time period, the causes, events and consequences of the Mormons and the gold miners migrating west. And remember, we have those two gold rushes that you need to know the difference between, which are the Californian and the Pikes Peak. And finally, the impact of migration on the west, including the impact that that had on the indigenous people. Have a number of past paper questions from the second time period of Making of America, 1839 to 1860. So please have a go at some of these questions as part of your revision. There is a spread of questions for all question types here. Use the video on how to answer the exam questions for Making of America to support you as you write, and obviously give these essays or questions to your teachers who will be happy to mark them. The next video in this series for the Making of America will be the third time period and the first topic within 1861 to 1877, and that is Civil War and Reconstruction.